The verse of the day is Genesis 15:6, and it says, "And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith." So to give a little recap, we've been covering the story of Noah. We're in the book of Genesis, and now we're moving into the story of Abraham. So Abraham, Father Abraham, there's a lot to say about him. As we continue to read through Genesis in the Old Testament, you're going to notice that God chooses certain people to talk to and to work through and to speak to the people through. And you're also going to read a lot of verses that explain that it's because of the people's faith that God used them, that God trusted them, that God healed them, that God counted them as righteous because of their faith. And what is faith? Believing in something that you cannot see, having complete trust or confidence in someone or something. So the story of Abraham starts actually in chapter 12. It's called the Call of Abraham. And the first sentence is, "The Lord had said to Abraham, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you." So God says, leave your family, leave where you are, your comfort, your home, and go to a land that I will eventually show you. And in verse 4 it says, "So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed." This is before God even told him where he was going. And I think that even speaks to the confidence that Abram had in God. And you might be like, okay, why are you calling him Abram? He was Abram, and then his name turned into Abraham later on. I think the first sentence in chapter 12 is super key, because how often do we want all the details? How often do we want to know how it's going to go before we move? But a lot of times God says things and has us take steps before we know what we're walking into, before we know all the details. And that is what requires faith. That is how our faith is built. Because do you trust God enough to step without knowing the full picture? Do you trust God enough to take the first move without knowing what the end game looks like? If you keep reading further in chapter 12, it says that he starts to move toward the land of Canaan. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I think that's interesting because God didn't say that in here, but that's where he started to move. And then in verse 7, the Lord appeared to him again and said, "I will give this land to your descendants." And I think a lot of times when it comes to faith, we have to just move and go with what we think the Lord is telling us. And a lot of times it's him leading us in the direction that we're walking. Even if it doesn't feel like those are the specific directions he gave us moving, and wherever we feel led to move, God is still guiding us in those decisions. And it's clear here because God didn't say go to Canaan. Abram started to move towards that place. And then the Lord appeared to him and said, "I will give this land to your descendants." So he's confirming that Abram was moving in the right direction and gave him more details as he started to move. If you keep reading further in chapter 12, Abram and Sarai, her name turns into Sarah later on, Sarah is his wife, move out of Canaan because there was a famine and go into Egypt. And Abram told Sarah, "Hey, I need you to say that you're my sister, because if they know you're my wife, they're going to kill me and try to take you." So he tells the Egyptians and later on Pharaoh that Sarah is his sister. But then the Lord sends a terrible plague upon Pharaoh and his household because Sarah was Abram's wife. So it was God being like, whoa, you can't take Sarah. She is already Abram's wife. And then Pharaoh catches wind of this and talks to Abram and says, "Why didn't you tell me Sarah was your wife? You've brought this plague onto me. Take her and go." And I think that story is very interesting because how often do we think we're not good enough for God because we do something like lie or fall short, or we don't measure up, or we don't do enough, or we think because we're not doing enough, God won't bless me, or I'm doomed. But I think that story just shows Abraham's humanity, and that he was scared and he was afraid that Sarah would be taken and that he would be killed. And God still counted him as righteous later on. God still saw his faith over his works, and it wasn't his works or him being perfect that qualified his faith. His faith was enough. Him having belief in God was enough. And I think the statement that Abraham believed God, he didn't just believe in God, but he believed God whenever he spoke. there is a difference there. There's a difference in believing in a God and believing what God says. And Abraham believed God no matter what his circumstances looked like. If you keep reading on, Abraham and Lot, who was his nephew, end up in some sort of conflict. They resolve it, and Lot gets captured. Abraham goes to battle to rescue Lot. And so there's a lot of conflict and a lot of hurdles that Abraham has to go through. So that also speaks to the fact that just because God counts you as righteous and you're pursuing God's way doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and there will be hurdles, because we still live in a fallen world with hurdles and with an evil one that wants us to hit these hurdles. That was a long intro into Abraham, but I think it was necessary. And then we hit today's verse where Abraham is telling God, Lord, what good are all my blessings if I don't have a son? And God says, look up into the stars, count the stars. That's how many descendants you're going to have. And then Abraham believed the Lord, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. Not because of anything he did to prove it, but because he believed what God said. And that speaks volumes. And it also shows that you're allowed to be honest with God about your doubt and your concerns. And God speaks to them and reminds us of what the promise is. So if you have concerns or doubts, be honest with him and ask God to expand your ability to trust and to believe what he says over your life, because that's what counts you as righteous. Your faith is what makes you well and what will keep you close and in alignment with God's heart for your life. Okay?